Life Audio.
You're listening to Therapy and Theology, and I'm your host, Carly Mercoulier. This podcast is a space where we explore popular topics and questions related to the convergence of faith, feelings, spiritual formation, and more. My prayer is that through these conversations, we will grow in our awareness of who we are as beloved children of God, learn to acknowledge our needs and emotions with curiosity and compassion, and rediscover the purpose and power of our unique stories through the lens of the gospel. As a licensed therapist and ministry leader, I want to give voice to the many questions we face while cultivating a clearer view of how our faith informs our healing journey. I don't have all the answers, but I am committed to going deeper and walking together. So whether you've been to therapy or know exactly what you believe when it comes to theology, I want to invite you to join this journey as we fearlessly name the complexities of our present reality and press into the hope of the gospel story. So are you ready? Let's jump into today's question and begin this journey together. Hello. Welcome back to Therapy and Theology, my friends. Today is a bittersweet episode because it is my final solo episode of this season of the podcast. We have one episode left next week, and it has been such an incredible year. For those of you that listen to the podcast weekly, thank you, first and foremost. And I hope that this season of the podcast, you have been encouraged and inspired by the many incredible stories and guests that have been able to share and walk with us through what it means to embody our spirituality, what it means to live out an embodied faith, and just this process of connecting the dots between our physical experience and God's goodness and His grace. And so as we finish this season, I thought it would only be fitting to share my personal process of learning to live in an embodied way. And next week, get to share with some friends about our process in learning that together through the physical activity of running. So whether you're a runner or not, I think for me, the process of running has taught me so much about the spiritual life. And so I'm going to use that as the analogy today. And then my friends will come on next week with me to talk more about this process that we've all come to by running together and how it totally connects to the spiritual context. And so if you run, you know that this process of becoming is one that takes time and attention and tremendous amount of endurance. But this was not the way I learned to run. For most of my childhood, my devotion for running came out of a fear that I was not good enough or strong enough or fast enough to be a runner. This physical form of exercise actually became so much more than a way to move my body. It became the way I lived my life. And so this analogy was born. Running after my worth, chasing after the standards that would make me feel seen and safe and secure. All of this running became my mode of being. And within this framework, my emotions, my spirituality, and my internal relationships were framed. Yet somewhere along the way, my running way of life gave way to burnout in various forms. My body ached. I started having chest pains. I was getting injuries from literally running. But more importantly, my inner world was overwhelmed and consumed with the need to progress and push its way through emotional difficulties for the sake of enoughness. So maybe you can relate to this. This experience is not just isolated to an athletic pursuit, but for many of us has become a way of life that impacts our bodies, our minds, our emotions, our spiritual life, and our relationships. For me, this process of not pacing myself has given way to a lot of undoing and learning what it means to actually pace myself, both in the physical act of running and in my spiritual process of healing, has been hard, but so, so powerful. And so when I think of pace, I think of this process of measuring a step, right? The definition of pacing is very much whether you're walking or running to continually take a rhythmic step. And for most of us, I think when we think of pacing, we think of slowness, right? It's just never the pace I want to go. And for many of my friends, they could probably tell you that this is true. I tend to do things quick. And whether this was a learned behavior or just my internal state, I have learned that it oftentimes comes with consequences that are impactful both for my body and my soul. So why is it so hard to pace? I don't know if you are similar to me in this, but as I reflect on my difficulty to find a pace that actually worked for me, I oftentimes would focus so much on the others around me. So I don't know if you've ever been in a race, but one of the things that can be challenging is when you start out, everyone's kind of going at their own pace. And sometimes there's actual pace markers like, oh, you run an 8-minute mile, you run a 9-minute mile, you stand here. But what oftentimes is the case is that people are inconsistent in their pace, right? And in this, we recognize that some people are going faster than others. Other people are going maybe slower than they actually could go, but they're pacing themselves because they know the mileage ahead of them. And so this foreknowledge is really helpful, but in my young spiritual process, in my young healing process, I think I've noticed that this difficulty to pace is so impacted by looking outward at others' pace and their progress. And so this comparison was so easy to get into because it really did in so many ways trigger my not enoughness, right? And so every time I would start comparing myself to those around me at races specifically, oh, they're running ahead of me, they're running faster than me, I need to keep up with them, right? This language can just so easily be translated into our present lives and into our healing journeys. And when I saw this take place, I realized that feeling behind, right, not measuring up to those who were ahead of me really bred this fear, right, and insecurity. And what I've noticed is that I like to win, don't we all? But this wasn't just contained to race day, right? Comparison always breeds competition. And when we start comparing ourselves to one another or to other people's process, it can really take us out of touch and disconnect us from our own process and from our own journey. And I think this is why when we look at scripture, just to connect it back to the spiritual process, it is so evident that we have each our own way of being, of becoming, of healing. And when I think of this analogy of running that's used in scripture, the writer of Hebrews talks about like making sure that we're running the race set out for us. And although this analogy is overused in many contexts, I think it's a really helpful foundation for recognizing, like, what is the race set out for you? Because my race might be very different than yours, and your race might be very different from mine. And so being able to honor that uniqueness and allow us to really turn inward about our process and healing can be so freeing. And also it can take away this competitive edge of trying to kind of chase down a sense of identity or a sense of self-achievement that's based on other people, but more so focused on what God has for us individually. And so this awareness of why it's been hard to pace really brought me back to wondering, is this why I'm becoming weary? If we are attempting to race ahead and compare to others, we strain ourselves, right? We become so weary and so tired. A lot of times in my work with clients, I will say, what does that feel like? I see you doing all the things. Believe me, I was there once too. And it's not that it's bad. These things are good things. Running quickly and getting all of these achievements are good things. And yet they can be not good for our bodies, our minds, and our souls, because they might be built on a woundedness or a way of being that's chasing after something that we already have. It's already been given to us. And so asking ourselves, am I striving to stay in the race? If so, I wonder if it relates back to our current pace, right? If you are striving to stay in the race, then it can easily relate to your current pace. And so this is why pacing is important. When we go back to the analogy of running, we find that pacing is actually a powerful tool for building capacity and endurance that supports the body optimally. I used to always start my runs out so fast. But when I started learning pacing from this perspective, my running of a 9 or 10 mile run, I needed to start slower, right? I needed to conserve my energy in order to withstand the mileage. And this can be so true about our healing journeys also, right? God is a God of long distance racing. He is a slow timer, and he is steady and strategic. And I think that this is really hard in a society that wants quick fixes or wants fast healing or wants success and achievement now. I always say to myself, it's my internal mantra, I am playing the long game, right? God is a God of slowness because he's an intentional God. And so I really have been holding this and recognizing that the pacing allows us to have an opportunity to plan our steps, to practice patience, so that we can increase our capacity step after step. You know, when I first started back racing this spring, I did a triathlon in the fall, then I took a break, and then I came back to racing in January, and I was training for this half marathon that my friends and I did a few weeks ago. And I was like, oh my gosh, I've got to get back into it. And my first few runs were rough. They were hard. My capacity was not very large, but week after week, consistently coming back to this effort of not worrying about my time, but slowing down to find a pace that I could sustain allowed me to build upon what I already had. So my 4-mile runs became easy, and then my 5-mile runs became easy. And slowly but surely, I was able to run 11 miles without as much of the challenge that I had at the beginning. Now, was it painful? Absolutely. But what we notice is our capacity to withstand the pain, to hold the tension, is so much different than if we're just racing ahead for a 9 or 10 mile race when we haven't actually built upon it, right? So it's the way we hold it in our bodies, the way we're able to manage or cope with the strenuous exercise. And so this is such a parallel process in therapy, and something that I take into consideration with a lot of my clients from a trauma-informed perspective. We cannot race out and think, I'm going to be healed in 6 sessions, or this shouldn't take so long. You know, the process of healing is so slow because it's so kind and it's so embodied if we're doing it in a way that's taking this gradual step into expansion and building upon it. You know, something that happens in the nervous system, like that we've talked about in the last few episodes, is that when we experience unsafety, we contract, right? And so our body cannot physically withstand an expansion if it doesn't feel safe to do so. And so this is my encouragement as we look at why pacing is important in the healing journey, is that our pace allows us to expand in a safe way. And as we do that over and over in small increments, it allows us to expand larger and larger. And so this can be so helpful, especially if you're working through spiritual issues or recognizing that the healing journey is maybe frustrating or becoming really tired in it, to take it slow, to take it gently, and to be able to recognize that our nervous system heals slowly, right? Less is more and too much is too much. And so being able to kind of recognize this body approach allows us to focus on the process and the present experience in the body rather than just getting to the finish line. And because we can miss so much, right? And our nervous system can't actually heal that way. And so in some ways, I think it monitors our motivation and aligns us back to our main goal, right? With our individual race being the center focus, our pace and our practice of increasing our capacity step after step after step. So how do we begin learning to pace? I think this is a really helpful and practical next step Because maybe you're wondering, I've lived this way for a long time. Welcome, me too. And I promise it's actually possible that we can shift our pace. If you've been racing through life and you feel burned out by whether it be your job or your activity, or you're chasing after enoughness or spiritual activity, whatever it is, here's a simple acronym that has helped me to begin practicing pacing in my life and also in my runs. So the acronym is PACE, obviously, but they stands for presence, attunement, capacity, and expansion. So let me break each one of these down really quick. Presence. Something that I noticed in my own process is that if I'm not being present in the moment, right, actually focusing on where I am right now, and I'm just so future focused, I can get really frustrated with myself, right? And so being present is actually a mentalization of, what do I need right now? What is the goal today? Not tomorrow, not next week, not 3 years from now, but my presence is showing up to the right now, right? Showing up to the right now. And in addition, if we take this from a spiritual perspective, I think presence is also inviting the presence of God in the right now and just being in the presence of the Spirit, right? And this can feel unproductive, as some of my clients would say. But yes, it also can feel that way, but it's shifting our attention to something else, right? Our pace is focusing on the present moment. And so it's going to feel very different for our body if we've been stuck in hyperdrive. So we do it in small increments. If we're learning to show presence to our right now, that might just start with 5 minutes. It might not be, showing up to a whole day, being present the whole day if we've never done it before. And so being able to show up and practice presence for 5 minutes is a really great place to start. I'm just going to be more attuned to the present moment. And that brings us to our second one. A is for attunement. What does attunement mean? Well, it can mean a lot of different things, but what I mean in this specific capacity of this acronym is attunement is awareness of our body, right? So am I being present, one, just in the moment? Because I have to be in the moment first in order to then attune to what's happening in my body, right? And so they kind of build off of each other. Our attunement is recognizing, where am I feeling weary, right? Where is this pace that I'm currently at right now working for me? And I like the word sustainability, because attunement allows us to recognize what is sustainable and what is not. If my body is in complete stress every single day, all day long, it's not sustainable, right? The level to which I'm trying to move or to run in my life. And so attunement allows us to modulate what feels okay enough, right? And this is a more somatic word or concept of, if we're in stress, if we're in a state of contraction, it's not always going to feel great. But what we want to do is, in that learning to expand our capacity in this healing process, it's just finding a little bit of space that feels different in our body. That feels like a breath of fresh air, right? I use a lot of senses work with clients to be able to recognize what feels different, what feels not like stress. Maybe it's the sun on our skin. Maybe it's a warm shower. Maybe it's tasting something delicious or a warm cup of coffee. Whatever that is, it's attuning to what feels connected so that we can keep building off of that as we kind of lean into stress and then come back to what feels good enough. Thirdly, capacity. This is something that is really hard to practice, because I think for myself, it's been something that I've learned to honor more readily than recognizing my capacity is not 7 miles when I haven't been running. It's 3 or 4 miles. And recognizing that capacity is exactly where I need to start in order to build, right? And so kind of taking an inventory of your capacity, what does that look like based on the other two? What is my capacity for the right now? And how is it being experienced in my body? That can be a really helpful frame for recognizing what our capacity is. And this capacity question or kind of note allows me to recognize for right now, what is my capacity to say yes? And what is my capacity that's allowing me to say no? And so that can be really helpful. If someone were to ask me, come run this race with me, I have to ask, right? Do I have capacity to even train for that race right now? And sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is no. And so really honoring the level of capacity that we have in order to increase our endurance. Again, we have to start within our area of capacity in order to build upon it. And then finally, expansion. And this is oftentimes something that is very slow, and we maybe won't notice it just one step after the other, but where are we expanding, right? One of the things that I think is important is we can kind of either white knuckle it on one side or just kind of give up and feel kind of like passive on the other side of this healing journey. But I do believe healing is about growing our ability to expand. And so there is progress in this slowness. It just might look or feel a little bit different. And so asking yourself, where is it that I want to expand? How am I growing and learning? And this can really help with kind of setting an aim, right? What is it that I'm wanting to expand in? Maybe I want to get to 5 miles and I'm at 3. Maybe I want to get to 10 miles and I'm at 6. Being able to kind of create a measurement and go slow and take the steps to get there can be a really helpful way to frame this, because the goal is expansion, right? Healing is this idea of a continual process that allows us to reconnect to all that is good. And so being able to expand into that space breeds confidence, right? It allows us to step into a race on race day and say, I have been present, I have been attuned, I have learned my capacity day after day. And so when I get to race day, my expansion is so much larger than it was when I first started. And I'm able to feel confident going into this race, knowing I can do this. Maybe I've never run the actual distance of the race, but I have built upon day after day my capacity to expand. And I can say and testify to this in both my spiritual and health journey, my healing journey, but also to the race day where I was running, 10, 11 miles. And then I got to race day and I was like, I was hurting at 10 or 11 miles a few weeks ago, but race day did something different. My ability to expand, my confidence going in, pacing with my friends throughout the race allowed me to finish well. And so one of the things that I have been really focusing on in this process of pacing, learning presence, attunement, capacity, and expansion, I've been thinking a lot about this in relation to Hebrews 12, where it talks about running the race with perseverance. And one of the things it says is looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured. And I think that this is my main hope in prayer and my process, is that when my eyes are on Jesus, right, there is such a different perspective than if my eyes are on someone else in my process, right? If my eyes are on achievement or impressing people or pleasing people, it allows this race to kind of be rushed, and it actually, I think it hurts me, right? It ends up not allowing me to run the race that's marked out for me and finish well. And so I encourage you each to recognize that the slowness and settling into a pace that's right for you in your given season will truly determine your ability to run with confidence this race that's marked out for each one of us. And so, looking to Jesus, our author and finisher, remember, his pace is slow, his attention is kind, and his invitation is to rest, and his gift is his goodness. So keep running well, friends.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of Therapy and Theology. If you have a question or topic you would like discussed on a future episode, please feel free to email me or drop it in the comments. Also, don't forget to subscribe to have each week's episode instantly downloaded to your podcasts, and see the show notes for resources mentioned in this episode. To access more content and join my monthly email list for the latest updates and info, visit my website at carlymarcluyer.com.